Hello, fellow kids, and welcome back to What is Politics, and this third episode of a four-part series about human social evolution over the millennia. On the surface, this mini-series is about how human social evolution tracks the four-quadrant political compass over time. Specifically, the version of the political compass that has economic equality versus economic inequality on the x-axis, and social conservatism versus social liberalism on the y-axis. But what this series is really about is how culture is an adaptation to practical conditions. So you get social liberalism or social conservatism or band structure versus tribal structure or urban civilization structure, hunting and gathering or farming or pastoralism or trade, depending on the practical conditions that a society finds itself in. Geography, climate, population density, presence or absence of other hostile or friendly groups in the area. And those conditions, in turn, shape the bargaining power, which shapes class structure, in terms of what kind of hierarchy it has or doesn't have. When it comes to bargaining power determining the class structure of a society, this should be a completely obvious insight. Class structure is about dominance hierarchy. It's about who, if anyone, gets to boss whom around, who gets to exploit whom. People will sometimes choose to submit to authority or to a hierarchy because it's practical and it helps them achieve their goals. Like when a street basketball team elects a captain, or when a workers' cooperative elects a manager that they'll obey so that production is efficient and the profits are better for everybody. And then they'll kick him out if he does a bad job. Those are democratic hierarchies. That's when the hierarchy exists to serve the interests of the people at the bottom. But a dominance hierarchy, a class structure, is when the hierarchy exists in order to serve the interests of the people at the top. And it's where the people at the top of the hierarchy use the people at the bottom for their own interests. And the interests of the people at the top come first. And that's an exploitation relationship. And nobody submits to an exploitation relationship because they really want to. They do it because they have to, because it's the least worst option. So obviously, if you have a class structure, a dominance hierarchy, it's because the people who are on the bottom have to be there. They're stuck there to a certain extent. And the people who are at the top because they can be there, because they have advantages that keep them there. And I say stuck to a certain extent because some dominance hierarchies are more flexible than others. A slave is more trapped than a serf, and a serf is more trapped, usually, than an employee. And an employee with high skills and savings and a lot of alternative job options in a labor shortage is much less trapped than an employee who's one paycheck away from getting evicted with no savings when there's a labor surplus. The severity of the dominance hierarchy is a function of how much bargaining power advantage the people on top have over the people on the bottom. And as we've been seeing in this series, the level of bargaining power is profoundly shaped and sometimes even determined by practical circumstances. And that could be things like presence or absence of hostile neighbors, presence or absence of escape options, population pressure, is there a labor surplus or a labor shortage? And ultimately, what this series and what this show are all about is to help us understand how bargaining power works and how conditions shape bargaining power so that we can figure out how we can maximize our own bargaining power in our own current conditions in order to help us stop our civilization's slide into exploding inequality and declining democracy. In the first two episodes of this series, we looked at the first two quadrants of the political compass. And we saw how the world starts out with largely egalitarian and rather socially liberal hunter-gatherer societies organized into bands without kings or chiefs or even permanent charismatic leaders. And they often, or maybe even most of the time, had gender equality. And we saw why people were organized this way, and how this was the situation for most people on this planet on and off for the first 300,000 years of human existence. But then, 12,000 years ago or so, all of a sudden, certain geological and climatic conditions in the world change. And as a result, you get more and more societies that still have economic and power equality between families. But now they start to have some dominance hierarchy, specifically male dominance and gerontocracy, within families. In various places around the world, the new conditions shifted bargaining power in favor of men, and especially old men. Though we also saw how in certain conditions, it was elder women who were the ones to benefit from gerontocracy. And together with these shifts, you also get a shift from band organization to tribal organization. And with this shift came a shift from social liberalism to social conservatism, for a bunch of reasons that we also looked at. Today we're going to look at the conditions that eventually allowed some people to hoard more wealth and more power for themselves and their families, so that you get an evolution from societies with equality between families and with no chiefs or with weak elected chiefs, into societies with social classes and more powerful hereditary chiefs, and eventually extremely powerful kings and emperors and states. And we'll also look at why we still end up with strong social conservatism in these types of societies. But first, please remember to like, subscribe, rate and review on all the stupid, evil garbage platforms, and share these episodes because the algorithm doesn't know what to do with political stuff like this that isn't just a confirmation bias jerk-off festival. And if you can, please donate. The links are in the show notes for one-time, monthly, or per-episode donations. And as you watch and listen to this stuff, keep in mind that I'm not just regurgitating things from a particular book or article like most channels tend to do. There's no particular book, at least that I know of, that focuses on the relationship between bargaining power and social structure. Our whole society is kind of geared around making us not understand this relationship. So it's just me writing that book via this show. And it's aimed at helping everyone understand politics in the most easy to understand, empowering, and actionable ways. And I've had profs on several different continents tell me that they teach some of my stuff in their classes. And Luke Kemp cited me in his popular book, Goliath's Curse. And also note that I do not monetize my channel because ads are stupid and annoying, and also for tax reasons because I'd have to start charging the tenants in my legal practice sales tax if I did that. So if you find what I'm doing valuable to you, and if you have a few extra dinars lying around to help keep this going, then please do so. And with that in mind, let the cartoon begin. So now we get to the top right quadrant. Economically unequal and socially conservative, politically authoritarian. Eventually, at different points, different tribal societies started to become hereditary chieftains and later kingdoms. And there are different routes to this social structure. Before hereditary chiefdoms, you would have societies that would elect to follow a chief or big man. And these leaders are people who often had no authority besides the authority of persuasion. Like in an egalitarian hunter-gatherer society, if you tried to become a persuasion type of chief, you'd literally be run out of the camp. And even to be an arbitrator for other people's disputes is considered dangerous and scandalous because it puts you above people, which is a huge social transgression in these societies. So when they need an arbitrator for something, they go get that from the neighboring pastoralists or Europeans or whoever it might be. But in other societies who found themselves with a need for frequent mediation and arbitration of disputes, and you have a lot of festering disputes in agricultural communities because you can't just leave when you're fed up with someone the way hunter-gatherers can. So to deal with this increased conflict, or to help corral people into consensus when there's division among people on important issues where you need social consensus, you'll find these chief, leader, or big man figures. And in the case of the famous Melanesian big man, his main role was to pump everyone up to produce more food in competition with the neighboring villages. He's like an economics cheerleading coach. And among the matrilineal Haudenosaunee that we were just talking about, they would elect a chief, but he didn't really have authority in local politics, which was dominated by women. And they were also the ones who chose the chief and they could remove him. The chief's authority was to represent the village when it came to outsiders, be it for trade or war, or treaties with other villages of the same ethnicity, or with foreign people, like their enemies, the Wendat, or with the growing number of European traders and politicians and armies that were coming into contact and eventually into conflict with them. But these types of chiefs were, again, mostly chiefs of persuasion. They were removable. As soon as people thought your leadership was whack, you get the sack. So, why did hereditary chiefs with actual authority emerge? Again, like with male dominance, it's about bargaining power. Often it's that one tribe or clan or family manages to leverage their bargaining power because they control the best resources in a territory. And as a result, they can buy more loyalty from neighboring related clans, or they can buy more loyal warriors to give them advantages over other clans. Or they can just distribute a lot of food to the less wealthy tribes and clans to get a degree of subservience or deference. We see this in the Pacific Northwest Coast peoples, many of whom are matrilineal. These are people who live primarily from salmon fishing in the summer season. And fishing has a lot of the same dynamics as farming. You have fixed territories. It's sedentary during the fishing season, and you can accumulate wealth in dried or smoked fish. So the families that managed to secure the best fishing spots, and therefore the most wealth, would eventually become the noble hereditary chiefly lineages. But they had to earn their titles by giving away wealth through big potlatch feasts to the less wealthy common members of the society, who were other lineages within the tribe or the clan, and who had access to less productive fishing resources. And you also had slaves in these societies who were people from foreign tribes who had been captured in raids and battles. And it's interesting to note that when you look at the archaeology of the Pacific Northwest coast, you see that they had an egalitarian structure for several thousand years before it became this chiefly hierarchical structure. And that's because during those egalitarian years, you couldn't really dominate or influence anyone too much because they could always just go somewhere else and do something else for a living. But once those formerly empty territories start to fill up with hostile people, the better choice is to just submit to the wealthier, more powerful people in your area than to go off and stake it out on your own where you might be killed by enemies. You had a similar system to this in Scandinavia among the Vikings. At first, warriors would choose a leader among themselves, and his authority mainly came from being a good military leader. And at first, this position would just end within the lifetime of the leader, when he stopped being such a good leader, or with his death. But eventually, as you got more wealth inequality, as some families managed to hoard more wealth for themselves via plunder and trade and conquest, or consolidation by other tribes, the leader would have wealth advantages that he would distribute out to other clans and neighboring people, just like the Pacific Northwest Coast people. And because of that, the leader's sons would have an advantage in becoming selected as the next leader. If he was generous with the family wealth, and if he happened to be a good leader, he would be chosen as leader. But then later on, as you ended up with much more distinct social classes, as the advantages of being wealthy compound with time, and having wealth means you have more opportunity to generate more wealth via trade and hired farm labor. You buy the best sword and the best shield and the best armor, you're going to be better at fighting. So the families of chiefs would also be the richest families who could just buy allegiance, and that way an inherited feudal type of system started to emerge. So in many places around the world, you see a sort of democratic temporary leader gaining advantage from that position to get more wealth, which they would use to give more wealth, which would buy them more loyalty, which would let them get more wealth, and through conquest and generosity, and as populations increased and the amount of wealth one could acquire and hoard and distribute also increased, these democratic leaders would evolve over generations into hereditary leaders from hereditary elite classes. One of the big factors in all of this evolution is increasing population density, which means there's more wealth to steal, tax, or plunder, or obtain by trade, which can sustain wealthier and wealthier elite classes. And that brings us to the emergence of the state. But actually first, let's talk about the difference between a chief and a king. A chief is generally someone who is the leader of a group of people who are related to each other. A leader of a clan, or of a group of related clans, or of a village which is composed of related clans, or a group of related villages, or an entire tribe which is made up of related clans. A king, on the other hand, is someone whose rule extends across tribal lines. In the Old Testament, the ancient Israelite tribes are led in one period by the so-called judges, and they were basically tribal chieftains, and they emerged in crisis to lead their specific tribes, some of the tribes of the nation, meaning the ethnic group of Israel. But eventually we're told that the Israelites as a whole believed that they needed more permanent leadership that could unify all of the tribes. They wanted someone who could more effectively lead and defend them in their conflicts with the Philistines. And although the prophet Samuel warns them that the king will end up enslaving the entire nation, the Israelites insist, and Saul is chosen to become the first king, meaning the first ruler of all of the tribes of ancient Israel. And a king has a qualitatively different form of power than a tribal chieftain has. Now, in tribal logic, your honor system duty to defend your tribesmen ends at the tribal level. You look at two Bedouin tribes and you think they're both Arabs and that they should be on the same team. But you look at the 1948 war between Israel and the neighboring Arab countries, and you have the Al-Haib tribe who joined modern-day Israel in the 1948 war, and then you have another neighboring tribe, the Subay tribe, who fights with the Arab forces. To our nationalist-baked brains, we imagine that you're automatically supposed to unite by common ethnicity. So this seems like treachery to fight for the Israelis if you're an Arab Bedouin. But according to tribal logic, it's completely normal to fight alongside a foreign power of a different ethnicity against your rival tribes of the same ethnicity because they come from a different tribe and you owe them nothing. And often the different tribes are actually your biggest enemies. And it helps to have a more powerful, wealthy patron to give your tribe more wealth and more power than your enemy tribes. And we saw this dynamic often in North and South America, with American tribes allying with different European powers to defeat their local enemy tribes. So a chief rules inside of tribal lines, and a king rules across them, and even across ethnic and religious lines. And a king rules by force, with hereditary office, whereas a chief usually has to rule with the consent and cooperation of the clans and families under his authority. And a king is the head of a state. And a state has a lot of definitions, but the definition I think that I'm gravitating towards is that the state is an institution that allows a certain group of people to be the final or ultimate decision makers over a given territory. Now, there are different paths towards the state. And just a bit earlier, I described how chiefdoms could evolve into states or become states by conquest. Another example is the ancient Sumerian civilization, which is thought to have been the first civilization, and it developed along the Euphrates and Tigris rivers in what's now Iraq. And a civilization is a society that's organized around multiple cities. You have several independent towns and small cities and small city-states before the Sumerian civilization arose, very early into the Holocene era that we discussed last time. The first civilization, which is the ancient Sumerian civilization, started with some sort of democracy. First, there were tribal egalitarian agricultural settlements, and eventually when you had enough population density and trade, you end up with some towns and urban centers where some people can live without having to farm. To get a city, you need enough wealth for people to live from without farming or hunting, and that comes from either trade or taxation or both. And these early Sumerian towns are thought to have still been democratic in the tribal sense. And then a state was formed uniting different cities and agricultural areas in order to help with the resource management and to coordinate defense, because raiders, like pastoralists, love to come steal from cities where there's a lot of concentrated wealth. In the ancient Sumerian region, resource management was a key impetus for state formation because you needed people to coordinate resource distribution in fertile and dry times because of the cycle of the rivers where everyone was based, which everyone depended on to live. And you also needed a state to deal with irrigation. So at first you had some democratic tribal process where elders or warriors or clan leaders were appointed or elected to organize things. But then over time, as population density increases and the need for defense increases, and there are more people dependent on river resource management, the fact of having that power to manage those resources allowed the people in charge of the state to become a hereditary ruling class that stopped being responsive to its constituent tribes. And that turned into a despotic kingdom and empire over those tribes and the surrounding agricultural regions. And in the case of Sumer, it seems that climate change facilitated this process. As the region became increasingly drier, people became more and more dependent on the state's irrigation process, and they had less avenues for escape. Like they couldn't switch to nomadic pastoralism or semi-nomadic horticulture or hunting and gathering. These ways of life were not viable in that region anymore. And that consolidated the power of the state elites. And actually, the rise of state civilization spurs on a lot of farmers to become pastoralists, because states love extracting wealth from farmers who can't escape. So, if possible, farmers will switch to nomadic pastoralism, which allows them to escape. And then they can become great warriors who go raid and steal from the state, and they become huge enemies of the state. States are always fighting against pastoralists in early times. And we see this even like in the 20th century. Whenever a new state forms, one of the first things they always try to do is stop nomadic pastoralism and settle them into agricultural villages that the state can control and extract wealth from. Crucial to this process of forming a state-controlling ruling class was an alliance between the political elites and the priests, the clergy class. And you see this in almost every authoritarian empire. The military political elites basically hire the religious figures to become themselves an elite co-ruling class, like a management class. And the job of that clergy management class is to legitimize the existence of the powerful warrior ruling class. And as part of this, you get the building of monumental architecture. In the case of Sumeria, you get these ziggurats, which are like early Lego-shaped pyramids, which are there to impress the peasants and lower classes as to how powerful and magical the ruling classes are, especially the ruler. And they're also there to feed the ever-expanding egos of the rulers, because as I discussed in episode 15, humans are not made to have a lot of power. We're made to have relatively equal power. And when you become all-powerful, you tend to become delusional and insane and mentally ill in various ways. Another very common route to statehood is when the warrior pastoralists that we just talked about, well, they coordinate and unite their various tribes so that they can conquer a bunch of farming villages and sometimes urban areas as well. Farmers are generally sitting ducks for states and for pastoralists because states have armies and pastoralists can come and go and they're natural fighters, whereas villagers are stuck in one place and always ready to be attacked and stolen from. So unless your village has enough of a population and enough resources to get weapons and enough spare time for people to get good at using those weapons, someone will eventually conquer you and turn you from a farmer into a peasant. And a peasant is a farmer who is subservient to a state. So pastoralists were running around forcing villagers to give them protection payments, like the mafia. And if some charismatic figure could unite the tribes, like has been done in various times in history, like Mohammed or Genghis Khan, well then these tribes could unite and conquer enormous territories. And when they do that, they become a new ruling class, and they live off of the labor of the peasants. And the state is the machine that they use to make sure that those peasants keep giving up that grain. Until the advent of democracy, most states were essentially just machines that one group of people would use to help exploit other groups of people. And that's actually the definition of the state as proposed by Marx and Engels. So these early pastoralist states had the ruling class made up of the conquering pastoralist nomads, whether they be Arabs or Mongols or Turks or Tatars or whoever. And the function of the state was to make sure that the peasants kept giving the rulers their grain, and later the merchants give their taxes. So the state was basically a set of tax collectors, of lawmakers and judges to impose the rules of the ruling class onto the other classes, and to maintain themselves as the ultimate arbiters of disputes and of rulemaking. And of course, they had armies to quell rebellions and to enforce tax collection, or else to expand their territories and defend their right to exploit their peasants from other exploiting ruling classes who wanted to expand their territories and exploit their peasants. And then, of course, you had the clerics. Like I mentioned, in every major empire, religion fused with the state in order to help control the peasants, to make sure that they keep their heads down and that they don't fight back against the state or against the elites. And also to make sure that they didn't fight each other, which would disrupt the transfer of wealth to the ruling elites. Christian kings and Muslim conquerors notoriously imposed their religions by the sword, while Romans let you do what you wanted so long as you also venerated their gods. And they famously clash with the fiercely monotheistic Jews about this. Meanwhile, the Mongols allowed all of their subject peoples to practice their own existing religions, Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Christianity, but they would also make sure to buy off the religious leaderships of all these different peoples to make sure that they would enforce compliance with the ruling class and that they would teach their religions in ways that conformed to being subservient to the empire. The connection between religion and state is also found in biblical allegory. I mentioned Saul, the first king of the Israelites, earlier. And it was Samuel, the same prophet, who warned the Israelites not to have a king in the first place. Well, he was the one who anointed King Saul. And it was also Samuel who later told Saul that God had rejected him as the rightful king. And he was rejected in part for usurping priestly functions. And even in Chinese empires, which were secular rather than theocratic empires, the empire would propagate Confucian philosophy, which would instill the proper respect for hierarchy. And they also controlled local religious practices, similar to the way that the Mongols did, and they exerted pressure on them to make sure that the religions of the empire were practiced and taught in ways that instilled obedience to the state, rather than in ways that gave people the wrong ideas. Religion is a very effective tool in peasant empires because most peasant villages tend to be isolated from each other. They don't have access to education. Often they don't have access to information. And the more that that's the case, the less independent that they are, and the more easily religion works to control them. You see a similar situation with slaves around the world. Like Haitian slaves who had vast social networks with each other and were able to exchange information, well, they were able to overthrow French rule. While American slaves, who were mostly isolated on different plantations or homes, and they couldn't share information or coordinate politically, if they ever rebelled, their rebellions were like suicidal and murderous, and they just ended up with the slaves getting murdered by their masters with the help of the state. And note that religion transcends race or ethnicity in most of these big empires. Most of these empires are multi-ethnic, and they unify their territories by religion, via a specific state religion like Christianity or Islam, or else via control over local religions like with the Chinese and Mongolians and Romans. And so, this is our top right quadrant, socially conservative and economically and politically unequal and authoritarian. Social conservatism was an element of social control exerted by the elites, as well as a function of tribal formations like we saw earlier. And also, social conservatism was a survival mechanism for the peasant classes. Peasants are notorious for being very conservative, and that's for two reasons. First, because deviations from proven farming practices and traditions can mean death and destruction from famine. Adopting a new farming practice might seem like a great idea in the short term, but then a few years later, or even generations later, it turns out to be a complete disaster with unforeseen consequences. And you just can't afford to take those risks when you're a peasant who's just living on the margins because your state rulers are just taking so much of your grain. So one example is pig farming. Like, pigs are not kosher, and they're also haram, and there are other pagan peoples from the same region in the southern Levant who also don't eat pigs. And also in the Near East and in the Nile region. And why do all these different religions follow the same taboo? Well, if you're an innovative farmer, you might flout tradition and you'd start raising pigs. And that would be enormously profitable. You get all this meat, and you can sell it and eat it. But pigs require a lot of water, and they eat a lot of the same staple foods that humans eat in that region. So over time, if there's a drought or a famine, you're using all of these precious resources, water and food, on the pigs, and you're accelerating drought and famine. And you're also causing famine in all the people who don't own pigs, and then all the poor people who don't have pigs will come and kill you. So it causes all of this social chaos, as well as causing environmental destruction. So you get these religious prohibitions and this conservatism, this adherence to tradition for tradition's sake and for the love of tradition. You get that to avoid anyone getting any bright ideas which seem smart in the short term but which are destructive in the long term. If all you're thinking about is economic gain and having bright ideas, you might flout this, even if you know what the consequences are. But if you really believe in impurity and you have this deep disgust for pigs and you have this deep religious faith, well, that will be much more effective than if somebody tells you, well, it's just not good for society if you do this, even though it'll make you rich. And there's a second reason why peasants are so conservative. And that's because deviation from social hierarchy and traditions will lend themselves towards independence and rebellion from the state or from the local lord who is hoovering up all your grain. And since you're in such a weak bargaining power position, well, rebellion and independence and disobedience, that can mean death and destruction raining down on you from your social superiors. So all around the world, peasants, meaning farmers who are dominated by a state, are notoriously fatalistic, passive, and conservative. It's a survival mechanism, both environmental survival and social survival. Now we have a sense of how, in various circumstances, increased population relative to the ability to get resources hemmed people in and gave them less escape options. And that in turn gave some people, who were well positioned in different ways, the opportunity to exert their influence. first by gifts and generosity, and later by buying loyalty, and then in straight dominance, by buying violence and imposing their domination over others by force, as slaves or peasants or serfs. And we saw how the state basically developed or arose for this specific purpose, to help the people on top of dominance hierarchies exploit the people on the bottom. And more people meant that there was more wealth being produced, which could be extracted by elites with higher bargaining power so that they could live grander lives at everyone else's expense. So in this phase of human social evolution, you get growing inequalities of wealth and power, which of course go hand in hand. And you also maintain the social conservatism of the earlier period because you still have the same tribal structures as before operating in these unequal systems of exploitation. And because conservatism is a survival mechanism for the growing percentage of people who became peasants. And it's a survival mechanism both in terms of surviving on the margins of subsistence and also in terms of surviving socially to avoid reprisals by brutal and violent ruling classes. In the next episode, we'll look at the fourth quadrant of our political compass, economic equality with social liberalism. And we'll see how changing conditions continued the rise of growing inequality of wealth and power, but then eventually something causes social conservatism to slowly break down, and we start to get a slow reversion to social liberalism. And then later on, we end up in an era of increasing democracy, which eventually leads to a shift away from growing inequality towards more equality of wealth and power, which we're now starting to see unravel again in our day. And that will kick off an ongoing discussion about what we should be doing to stop the backsliding and to get us back to a situation of democracy and relative equality and freedom that, in my opinion, human beings are built for. And after that, I'll do a Q&A episode where I'll answer all your questions about the series that you've been posting in the comments. And I might include some questions about some other episodes, like the cancel culture stuff that people seem to have a lot of misconceptions about that I want to clarify, or else I might make separate episodes for that. And for those of you listening on audio podcast or watching on video, there are links in the show notes for the other format. And the video versions often pack in a lot of extra information with charts and graphs and books and sources that I'm citing from. And for some insane reason, I get about 10 times more audience for the video version than for the audio podcast, which is insane to me because watching is so much more inconvenient. But anyways, send me money if you can. And until next time, see ya.